Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to the 15th meeting of the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I've received no apologies from members. And agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. Are we agreed to taking item 5, which is consideration of our work programme, in private? Members content? Yes. Grateful. The second item is to take evidence on the Scottish Parliament elections, etc. Miscellaneous Amendments Order 2025. You will recall that we took evidence on this order from the Electoral Management Board for Scotland and the Electoral Commission at our meeting on the 4th of September. Today, we have the opportunity to take evidence from the Minister for Parliamentary Business before we go on to consider whether or not to recommend to the Parliament that the order be approved. So, can I welcome to the meeting first, obviously, Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Parliamentary Business, who's joined today by Ian Hockenhull, Head of Elections Team, Scottish Government, Jordan McCory, and Lorraine Walkinshaw, Scottish Government Legal Directive. Can I say good morning to all. Before we take questions, I think, Minister, you would like a few minutes to open.
Yes, that's okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me today to be able to speak to this order, which seeks to make improvements to electoral law ahead of next May's Scottish Parliament election. The changes build upon the Electoral Reform Bill, which you as a committee considered last year and we passed as a Parliament last year. Many of the topics in the order were highlighted as that bill progressed through Parliament. Several changes are technical adjustments designed to ensure the smooth running of the election, and others have been requested by various stakeholders. I'd particularly like to highlight one change which first arose during our consultation at the age which people can stand for an election. In a roundtable discussion with my predecessor, a young person with experience of the care system highlighted challenges she had faced in seeking to register to vote. This order specifically responds to her comments by allowing looked-after young people to register to vote by declaration of local connection. So I hope she can reflect on the change that we're making to the law today. Another change, or I hope to make, I should say, very presumptuous convener, another change provides an example of how electoral law can develop across the UK, with changes in one nation influencing others. In 2020, the Scottish Parliament created an exemption for certain candidate expenditure in relation to security. The UK and Welsh Government subsequently adopted that change, but went a little further, applying it to security costs beyond those associated with public rallies or events. We are now seeking to adopt that expanded definition. It is clear, unfortunately, we all know that candidates are often experiencing greater and greater security challenges, and this is intended to offer some assistance. Other changes seek to complete the process begun with the bill last year on updating rules and campaigning, including on undue influence and notional expenditure. These rules will now be in line with those for UK Parliament elections. The order also builds on experience during the pandemic in relation to emergency rescheduling of elections. Moving the beginning of the dissolution period for the Scottish Parliament is intended to provide some further resilience. The law currently says that dissolution is to occur 28 working days before the poll, and we are seeking to reduce that to 20 working days. For next year's election, that means moving from the 26th of March to the 9th of April, but it is anticipated that Parliament will go into recess on the earlier date. The reason for that is to allow Parliament to meet in exceptional situations. For example, if a Prime Minister were to call a UK Parliament election for a date on or near to the date set for the Scottish Parliament election. We've worked with stakeholders to ensure that there will be no change to the electoral timetable with this change. We're also seeking to make a number of changes to emergency proxies, assisting people in voting in the run-up to the election. This includes a change to allow those accompanying people to medical appointments shortly before the poll to obtain an emergency proxy. I'd also like to highlight that the order introduces a broad requirement for returning officers to provide appropriate support to aid voters with accessibility challenges. It's hoped that, along with guidance from the Electoral Commission, this will greatly improve the support offered. The development of the order has involved close engagement with key stakeholders, including the Electoral Management Board for Scotland and the Electoral Commission. And I would like to place on record my thanks to them for their engagement and look forward to working closely with them in the coming months on the preparations for May 2026. I hope that the committee will agree that the provisions are positive changes that will benefit voters, candidates and administrators, and it will therefore give its support to the instruments. Just one final point, if you'll indulge me, Convener had written to the committee to highlight the issue of the online absent voting application. We have been working closely with Welsh and UK governments to ensure access by voters in Scottish Parliament elections to ensure access to that service. I'm sure we would all welcome the prospect of voters being able to apply for a postal or proxy vote online. In my most recent letter to you, Convener, highlighted that serious concerns have been raised about a go-live for the system occurring before May next year. Whilst I'm happy, of course, to discuss that point further today, if you're inclined to, Convener, I did make that point in my letter to you, I just wanted to let the committee know I have already set in motion a mitigation measure. This is set out in the statutory instruments that will be laid on Monday to delay any signature refresh for absent votes required before the election in May until the end of 2026. This should reduce any scope for confusion between voters applying for a UK Parliament absent vote on the online absent voter application system and the separate process for Scottish Parliament elections. And along with Ian, Lorraine and Jordan, I'll be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
I'm very grateful for that, Minister, and I think we'll just go straight to questions. And Annie, can I come to you first, please?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister and your officials. You mentioned about the dissolution period in your comments, and I would just like to understand what discussions you've had with parliamentary authorities in relation to the reduction. And I know you've said it will probably still be the earlier date rather than the 9th of April, so just what discussions have been had?
They're at a fairly early stage, but Parliament are aware that we're taking forward these changes. And I suppose it's kind of akin to the situation we had in the run-up to the 2021 election, whereby we also changed the dissolution period. Now, I'm not proposing we do quite the same as then, where everyone remained a member of Scottish Parliament right up to the point of the election. That was obviously for very specific circumstances related to the pandemic. But the rationale is, as I've explained and set out, that, and I think we're primarily thinking of the circumstances in which, it might be felt to be rare, but it could happen that the UK government decide to call a general election that falls either on the same day or in close proximity to a Scottish Parliament election. And changing this period would enable us, because the challenge we face there is that the lead-in period for UK general elections is actually presently shorter than the Scottish Parliament period, and we're switching that around because that would then enable the recall of Parliament for Parliament to be able to consider such an issue. Would we want to then delay the Scottish Parliament election, for example? Now, there are powers available. We've legislated for this that the presiding officer could do so, but in such circumstances it might be felt, well, that would require and merit wider discussion by Parliament as a whole, and that would enable the presiding officer to recall Parliament if he or she was inclined to do so. But in terms of the practical experience, we're already engaged with dialogue around the creation of a short recess period to replicate the period of dissolution that we presently have under legislation. So, to all practical purposes and intent, people wouldn't notice any difference. And I'm also aware that the Electoral Commission are actively engaging with the Scottish Parliament as well to think through how practical guidance would be laid out for those who are simultaneously members of the Scottish Parliament and also candidates in the election. I think that's, and sorry, going back to the consideration of Parliament, I think that's likely to, but it'll be a matter for Parliament to determine effectively the cessation of normal parliamentary activity or normal activity for parliamentarians, the lodging of written questions, for example, things like that will probably be suspended for the duration of any recess. But final details still to be worked out, but there is engagement.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
I suppose just to clarify, because in essence what we have are two separate timetables that are now slightly overlapping. We have a parliamentary timetable that will overlap for a period of time with an election timetable. And at the point of dissolution, although not yet set, although the Minister has indicated when it's likely to be, an at that stage, all current MSPs would cease to be MSPs and there wouldn't, in fact, be a Parliament except for the PO herself, who stays in post, and those decisions would be made. So what we're talking about is that overlap period where there's the challenges, and I think, as you said, Minister, that discussions are ongoing about effectively the dual role some candidates will have of both being an MSP and also a candidate. Is that...
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's very much a moot point. I mean, the circumstances in which Parliament's likely to be recalled are, and clearly it didn't happen in the coronavirus period, but I think it was probably more likely it could have happened than we will see going forward, and certainly for 2026. But it's just to cover all eventualities. But in practical terms, you know, as we saw in the 2021 election, you know, the day-to-day functions of being an MSP didn't really remain in place, and everyone was focused on being a candidate.
Good, thank you. Emma, can I come to you?
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister. On accessibility, the order removes the detailed description of the tactile voting device in legislation, replacing it with a broader requirement for returning officers to provide appropriate support to aid accessibility at voting stations. The Electoral Commission is also required to provide guidance as to this support, and a consultation, I understand, is underway on that guidance. Could you provide an update on any feedback or engagement that you've had with organisations representing or advocating for those who might require this support?
So actually, not so long ago, in this very Parliament, I engaged with the cross-party group on sight loss to discuss this very matter. And there were a number of organisations around the table who obviously campaign for, advocate for those with sight loss. There are also people in the room who themselves have experience of sight loss. And we had a very useful discussion, and the clear sense was that it was understood that this change was effectively to try and improve accessibility. Now, I know that might seem, and we obviously went through this as we discussed the passage of the bill, it might seem counterintuitive to say, well, we have something very prescriptive and says that a specific tactile voting device must be provided, where we move to something that's more general about the need to provide some form of aids to ensure accessibility. But the first thing I would say is that this has been the experience in terms of UK elections. There were many things that I think we could have said could have been improved about the UK election and the Scottish experience last time round, but this wasn't one of them. This worked in practice, and effectively what we're seeking to do is move away from the prescription of a specific form of tactile voting device which isn't flexible, and the feedback is that does not work effectively in terms of ensuring the ability of someone to cast their vote in secret. And again, I think Chris Highcock from the Electoral Management Board gave a very clear example of at the last election, because the ballot paper for the Scottish Parliament election can be quite long. They had to actually put two of the existing tactile voting devices together, rather than what has been designed in future, where there will be a prosaic, specific tactile voting device designed around how many candidates are on the ballot paper. I think we would all agree that that's a more sensible provision. So, and indeed, if members of the committee will recall, I think I actually sent some samples of what are being worked on to the committee. So hopefully it was felt that that was a demonstration that the type of innovation that's being taken forward just now will improve things. But yes, there's been engagement with the Electoral Commission around this, with those who administer elections, but also those who represent the broad swathe of people who might have additional accessibility needs. And of course that engagement will continue, and you know, there'll be further innovations and adaptations in future, I'm certain, as technology advances and as things are tried out and continually improved, and that's what this change will enable.
Yeah, I think given the variance in how a disability can affect a person, flexibility is always going to be welcome. The concern would be then the training of staff and their knowledge base and skills to be able to support people in the way that they most need. How's that going to be progressed ahead of the election?
Well, that will be the responsibility of individual returning officers, but certainly through engagement with the Electoral Commission, that is something that, and you know, having had dialogue with the Electoral Management Board and those who represent that community, I think that's well understood, and they take that responsibility very seriously indeed. And that again comes through engagement with those with practical lived experience and those organisations who represent those with practical lived experience to actually understand what is required for that group. So that's my expectation, and I certainly know it's one that's taken seriously by those who are involved in administering elections.
Okay. Has there been engagement with folk who represent or have lived experience of being disabled in other ways apart from sight loss as to what more assistance they might need?
I believe so. I'll maybe hand over to Ian. He might be able to say a little bit more.
It's primarily the Electoral Commission that does that engagement. So they've been working. They've effectively done this process already for UK Parliament elections, because the same duty was introduced in the Elections Act from 2022. So they've gone through the process of producing new guidance, which seems to have been generally quite well received, and now they're effectively looking to do very much the same thing with this duty here. And they actually mentioned in their response to our consultation on this proposal last year that aligning the rules between UK Parliament and Scottish Parliament elections should hopefully help voters in these kind of situations, and it'd be less confusing if the support is the same. So the specific details on how they've engaged, that would probably be an issue we could ask the Electoral Commission to update you on, but it's very much there.
In terms of the order, there have been concerns raised about people being able to support more than one disabled voter, and the concern about undue influence or control maybe being exerted. That concern must exist for postal votes as well, where there's less visibility over who is completing the forms and how that process has been undertaken. Has there been any consideration given to that, and what more might be in legislation to protect disabled people?
So we'll always be willing, and I think that speaks to the point. There are a number of other issues that we've consulted on that aren't included in this order, and perhaps we'll focus on that, but there's always going to be the continuous process. Indeed, for the 2027 local government elections will be another order. So if we're informed by things that are the practical experience of individuals, if other concerns are raised, then of course we'll consult on that and make further changes. I suppose right now, in terms of postal votes, what we rely on, of course, is the signature of the individual returning the postal vote to make sure that it's been cast in accordance with the expectation and electoral law. There is, of course, I'm afraid to say, always going to be a limit to how much can be done in terms of oversight of how that is specifically done in the home or wherever a person might fill out their postal vote form. That's just going to be a practicality that isn't always going to be accounted for. But if there is more that can be done, then of course we should reflect on that. And going back to the other point around the number of people that an assistant might be able to help to the polling station, that's again something that we'll give further consideration to. Right now the number is 2. I think there's good reasons for that, because it's to try and account for the very concern that I think you're speaking to. But equally, we've heard it could be helpful for those who work as carers to be able to undertake that role for a slightly larger number of people. So it's about trying to get that balance right, but that's something we can give further consideration to.
Yeah. Would it not be safer for everybody if the person supporting a disabled person who needs assistance in a polling station to be somebody who doesn't know them?
It's a legitimate point to raise. That would be, I think, a fairly big change, because as much as that, I could understand the point that could be felt to say, well, we're making sure there's absolute impartiality. You then also have to reflect on, well, is that going to be what the individual casting their vote they might actually want it to be someone they know and they trust. So it would be about trying to strike the balance. But I've not earnestly heard it given as a significant area of concern. If that was to emerge, then of course it would be something we need to reflect on.
Thank you. Just to return to I suppose, a clarification point, there seems to be a tension between the new Rule 38.4a and the previous Rule 46 regarding assistance. My understanding is that historically the rules were designed to actually cast the vote rather than the journey from going into the polling station throughout. And certainly our fellow committee raised concerns regarding this in correspondence with the Minister. And I suppose really it's just to put on the record as a representative of the Scottish Government whether you're content that the manner that's been directed in Rule 46 will actually work in practice, which I think you very much hinted at in the answers already, particularly given that part of that policy intention is to allow for future innovation in relation to the types of devices and indeed the type of support that can be offered going forward. Would that be fair?
Yes, I am broadly speaking content. Of course, these things are borne out by practical experience, and I think that's the point I just made to Ms Roddick. So if a concern emerged, then we would need to reflect on it. At this stage, I see nothing that would cause significant concern. I think it makes sense to have something that is adaptable and flexible rather than coming back to specify each form of method of assistance at each election in the form of taking forward an order. And, the expectation is, and every evidence points to, that these things are subject to consultation. There's no sense that the community of those administering elections wants to do anything other than maximise and help the greatest number of people to cast their vote.
So for the purposes of the election next year, the Scottish Government are content that the interpretation is in the right place to allow the support that's going to be offered in
Indeed.
May next year?
Indeed.
Good. The other point that I was going to raise in relation to this was over the equality impact assessment, and twofold. Firstly, in relation to the timing of it. Given the content of the impact assessment, why did it take so long to come with the order? Why was it so late in its publication?
I understand these things as a concern, and there's always an attempt to try and make sure that everything comes as quickly as possible.
At the right time.
Ultimately, there's always a challenge in terms of officials working on multiple things at any given time, and there's only so many people to do it. So we will always try and make sure that things are provided in enough time to ensure adequate and proper scrutiny of these things. If there are any particular concerns, then of course we're happy to reflect on them and hear what they might be.
And absolutely, it is about giving an adequate and proper scrutiny in relation to it. And this one was published on the 16th of September. And I absolutely accept, and there is no criticism at all aimed at any of those that support the Minister about it. But there are timetabled provisions for these to be provided, and they were considered because that was the period of time for adequate and proper consideration. The one element that does concern me about the contents of the impact assessment is in relation to and you acknowledge this in it, the subjective challenge of taking impact assessment challenges from young people themselves and how it's achieved. Obviously, within the process of this order is one thing, but on a slightly wider scale with regard to the work that was done previously with the bill that's now an act and the other legislation, are you any the wiser about how to reach out to young people and to actually try and measure the impact assessment on them rather than taking those that in some cases feel they speak for them, in fact do speak for them, but others that say the subjective evidence is there's no problem here and it must be good because we say it's good?
There was a wry smile on my face because I'm increasingly less and less inclined to view myself as a young person. All we can do is try and engage with the widest range of organisations that represent young people, but through them actually engage with young people. So I'm never going to be satisfied with just the process of allowing people to speak for young people. Now, they play a role, and we'll listen to that voice, but let's try and use those organisations that have the greatest range of engagement with young people to actually speak to young people themselves. That would be what I would want to do, and that's a commitment to doing that on an ongoing basis. And I would reflect on the point I made in my opening remarks about the provision that we've made in terms of the ability for those who were looked after children to be able to register with a local connection. That's been directly influenced by one young person engaging directly with my predecessor. So hopefully that's a demonstration that we do these things. Can we always do better? Probably. But it's the age-old challenge of trying to reach out to those that we find it hard to reach. We must always try and do as much as we can, and that's the commitment of the government to do so. And you know, in this specific instance, young people, but there are plenty of other cohorts of people that we could say the same for.
So the part that concerned me, I mean, given the passage of the UNCRC here, given the very, very strong foundational requirement for human rights, that within the impact assessment, it states that officials are largely reliant on anecdotal evidence from electoral administrators. And we are talking about, firstly, a relatively small group, if we look at those coming out of cared for, but also a group that contain, you know, some of the most vulnerable individuals. And I suppose the question is, are you genuinely content that you're reaching an understanding of what their needs and expectations are? Absolutely, with one single person's input, which has been invaluable in actually occasioning this change. And I absolutely echo the Minister's thanks and hopes that this is good evidence that you can, as an individual, change policy. But are you content that actually it's capturing the expectation and needs, particularly of this group, particularly the evidence we've heard about the geographic challenge that this brings?
Well, in so much as we've made the change, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Yes, I am satisfied because we made the change to enable it. In terms of, I suppose, the point that's being made around the practical experience of people engaging with the process of casting their vote, yes, we are often relying on the feedback of those who administer elections in the first instance. I suppose what I would go back to, though, convener, is that then leads us to, if an issue is raised and as an area of concern, then we must engage with that wider cohort of people, in this instance again young people, to try and seek to understand what the problem might be and how we can resolve it and how we can do better. So I suppose the point we're trying to make there is that, and inevitably, I suppose it's true of the experience of any election, if there's a problem encountered, then you're relying on those who administer elections in the first instance to flag what those problems might be.
I think the challenge and danger is it's the problem encountered, and that if an individual is unable to vote, the problem won't be encountered by those that are feeding back. It just won't have happened. And certainly, to go back to evidence we heard in relation to the bill, and understandably, this is not a criticism that you in turn use those in the electoral field in the wider sense to do the outreach to all of these groups. But we've heard on a number of occasions the challenge that is, both with resource, but actually also just the practical of how we speak to some of, you know, the most marginalised groups from a democratic point of view that we have. So something you will continue to consider.
Of course, and you know, we flip back on the passage of the bill. We've put in a specific provision about the requirement for the Electoral Commission to engage in an awareness-raising campaign about how people cast their vote in terms of local government elections, because we know there can often be confusion there. We know that that manifests itself in some communities more than others. It was Bob Doris who was raising this and flagging this. So again, there's another means of being informed by someone that's raising this as an issue because they've identified it as an issue in their community. So you know, I take the point that you know, those who don't cast their vote, how do we understand better what the impediment there has been? And you know, sometimes I think we can readily identify that. It's one of the reasons, incidentally, that the government doesn't support the use of a form of ID to go and cast your vote, because that was one of the very issues we have flagged. If there are other issues, then we just have to do our best to try and understand what it might be, and that comes around as the process of constant engagement. So in the case of young people, again, relying on engaging with those organisations that represent them, who have the most direct contact with young people themselves, who will then be able to facilitate a conversation with young people, some of whom may have not cast their vote and will tell us the reason why.
Well, that's helpful. Ruth, can I come to you?
Convener. Good morning, Minister. I'd like to ask you about the timing of the count. When you've not specified a requirement for an overnight count in the order, but you have expressed your preference, and I think it's a preference that's shared by many of the committee, not all of the committee, but most of us. And there are, obviously, there's a bit of self-interest in that. I think we'd be the first to admit that getting through that is preferable for candidates, but there'll be wider interest in that as well from voters, from the media. Can you speak to why your preference is for an overnight vote? I think as well we'll be concerned about consistency, and the Electoral Management Board have given assurances to the committee that there will be consistency. How would you be looking for them to communicate whatever decision they take with regards to whether it's an overnight count or not to candidates, to voters, to the media, to interested parties?
So,
personal views, but it represents the government.
yes, indeed. And my own personal view is largely just based on its IB, and that's the way it's been, and I quite like it being done that way, which I probably then reflected and said that's probably not enough reason to direct the Electoral Management Board to take a particular decision. So that's why I have not done so. And I think it also represents that there are different views on this. Some would contend that yes, a next day count is preferable to the overnight count. Some people like the overnight count. Some of that might be media driven because they like the drama of being able to go directly to the count and report on it overnight. Although again, I would observe that in of itself isn't a reason to do it. So I think the fact that there are different views really led me to conclude that it wasn't appropriate or necessary to replicate what's been done at UK level to specify that the count must begin as close as possible to within a 4-hour period, and if there are reasons that couldn't happen, then the returning officer has to explain it, and so on and so forth, to just relying on trusting those who administer our elections to make the right decision. Now, that said, in making that decision, I think it is of fundamental importance, and I have made this point, and I said this to the committee in correspondence, and I made this point quite clearly to the convener of the Electoral Management Board, that whilst of course these things are a decision for the community of those who administer elections, I think it is very important that it's done on a consistent basis. I don't think we want one constituency being counted at this time and another starting at this time. We do want it to be a consistent application, and that is something I think I'm clear on. But again, I don't think having engaged with the Electoral Management Board requires a specific form of prescriptive legislative decision. Now, I will say, if it turns out that we in future feel that is required, then we shouldn't hesitate to reconsider that matter. But at this stage, I don't think it is required. I get the very clear sense that that's, well, I was going to say understood, but not only understood in the sense of that's the expectation. I think they themselves recognise that that's an absolutely necessary part of the experience of administering the election. In terms of communication, yes, I think it has to be fairly clearly communicated in the first instance to those who are participating in the election as candidates and those who support them, election agents and so on. But thereafter, to the wider public, that they shouldn't turn on the telly at 10 o'clock and expect the election programming to begin. They might have to wait a bit longer. But I wait to see what the decision of the Electoral Management Board is in consultation with returning officers. I do know that a significant majority of returning officers favour a next day count.
Thank you.
Don't know whether any other committee members have questions on that point. And just to clarify, there is not yet a recommendation come from them as to whether it's an overnight or next day count yet.
Certainly none has been communicated to me, Convener.
Fine. Sue, can I come to you?
Yes, so the convener has already touched on this slightly.
He's stolen your question, you mean?
Tiny bit, Minister. So if you... We have, you mentioned there about the importance of young people, looked after young people specifically. There we go. We heard from the Electoral Commission that there was going to be a roundtable with organisations to work with care experienced young people to explain to them the changes and what that meant to them. So what work does the Scottish Government have planned, aligned or along with the Electoral Commission or other organisations to assure that looked after young people or those formerly looked after and aged under 21, because it's quite a broad band, are aware of this declaration of local connection in terms of their ability and right to vote now?
I mean, to be perfectly candid, I think we ultimately rely on the Electoral Commission to take forward that work, because clearly they are perceived to be a non-partisan, impartial entity in undertaking that work, and they're discharged to exercise that function. Also, those who are responsible for electoral registration to be able to communicate that. I certainly think, and I go back to the point I made earlier, there are many organisations that can assist with the dissemination of that information, and I suspect, in fact I know, that those will be the organisations that are around the table with the Electoral Commission. So the Electoral Commission will have to hear what is said to them by these organisations, reflect on that, and then act accordingly. And
I'm sure they'll be best placed in a data-driven world to have a look at the success of that, perhaps after the fact, and reflect on that.
Indeed, I mean, we do have, the data we have is in terms of the numbers of those aged 16 or over who cease to be looked after but eligible for continuing care, who would now be able to exercise this right. So in 23-24, there were 967 children and young people who were eligible. About 33% entered continuing care. And as of the 31st of July 2024, which I think is probably the most recent figures we have available, there were 1,115 people, young people, in continuing care. So we have that type of information. So I guess, yes, against that information, you can then have some form of assessment as to how many young people are exercising that right. I suppose the other thing, of course, we have to reflect on, as well as, it's a right, it's not something that
they don't have to do it.
That is a requirement, or people can be compelled to do. So we need to bear that in mind as well.
Definitely. Thank you, Minister. That was all from me.
Excellent, thank you. The Minister mentioned at the outset the online absent vote application and the procedure, the Members' Bill that's heading way down. There is no feasible prospect for that being in place for the election May next year. Because of the timing, because of the requirements, and it would be unfair for anyone to have an expectation it would be in place for that election. Is that a fair summation of where we are? I
think, broadly speaking, yes. There is the remotest of possibilities. There is an outside chance, but I think it's very, very unlikely. And I've been seeking to engage with the UK government on this matter. I mean, I think in the first instance, I'm very grateful to Tracy Gilbert for taking forward the private Members' Bill. But I have been clear. I've been clear at all stages, Convener. My preference would have been that this was devolved through a Section 30 order, and on that basis, I'm confident we would have been able to legislate for the provisions, put it in place in time, and been able to get this in place in time for the 2026 election. We've had to rely on the UK Parliament. It's got caught in the UK Parliament because of their Byzantine process that you'll understand a lot better than I will, Convener, having been a member of Parliament. And it's very unfortunate. I think it could have been avoided. I'm seeking to engage with a wide range of people to, at the very least, express frustration and say I hope there are lessons learned. And I also know that I spoke with Jane Bryant, who is my counterpart in the Welsh Government, and they are also having to grapple with this issue as well. But, that was a long way of saying, yes, broadly speaking, you are correct.
I suppose the follow-on question in relation to that is, and I know the Minister shares this, that we'll just call it the 6-month period before the election, where we need a very stable, unchanging environment in which for the election to account. Should, on the off chance, this be able to come in, is the Minister utterly convinced that it won't unsettle that settled playing field before the election? Or can people watching on go, no, we can still agree that 6 months out we know what it's going to look like?
So I think that's why I'm saying it's the remotest of possibilities. Right. So the Gould period begins on the 7th of November. So I think the likelihood of Tracy Gilbert's private members bill getting royal assent in time is very remote indeed. It's possible, but it's at the upper end of the outside chance. So again, that's probably a long way of saying I've more or less made a decision to say it's not going to be possible, but I'll communicate that shortly. But as I go back to the point I made earlier, and I wanted to make that clear to the committee, I didn't want the committee feeling I hadn't informed them that we are laying regulations on Monday to take account of some of the concerns to ensure that those who have a postal ballot for the Scottish Parliament election, that will be extended so that it doesn't get caught up in any of the confusion that might arise.
That's very helpful. And my last question, I suppose, is in relation, again, hinting at the 6 months. Other than the events that you're talking about for Monday, which is in relation to people who are already registered for a postal vote, for that to be extended so that there's no perceived risk of losing it, is there any other further secondary legislation envisaged? Because there's a number of matters that were consulted on which haven't appeared in this instrument. We're getting close to the 6 month period. No intention of bringing anything further other than what you've indicated to us that you are aware of this morning.
I do not want to mislead the committee, so I'm just going to quickly double check.
Well, there's a lot of...
Well, you can maybe just say to the committee.
There are quite a few instruments, not least those preparing for an online absent voting application go live whenever that occurs, but not with a bearing on the election next year.
Yes, that's the part that I'm trying to ensure that we're all going to maintain the 6 months plus a little bit because of the time these things have to go through.
I don't anticipate it would only be in extremis that we would there's that's nothing fine. Anticipated, and on the now Ian's confirmed there is nothing anticipated that would catch the committee on the hop. But on the points you've made in areas that have been consulted, not included in this order, that's largely on the basis of they will either be captured by an order that will look at matters of voter registration, which weren't required for this election, and another specific order, which I've already mentioned, another specific order, a conduct order for the 2027 local government election. So there's time yet to do them, and the imperative wasn't to get it done in time for this coming election.
That's very helpful, Minister. Do the committee have any other questions, or can I close this evidential session of it? Excellent. If the Minister is content, I'm happy to move on to the next item, which will be a debate on the motion XS6M 18103, which will seek the committee's agreement to recommend to the Parliament that the Scottish Parliament elections, etc., miscellaneous amendments order 2025 be approved. As members will be aware, and to remind those watching, only the Minister and members can partake in this debate. So, may I invite the Minister to move the motion?
I move and commend this order to the committee.
I'm very grateful. Would any committee member like to speak on this matter? Oh, there we go. Well, then I can move to a conclusion of it. So the question is that motion S6M 18103 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes, unanimously. I am grateful. Then the committee will report on the outcome of our decision in due course. Are members content to delegate the authority to approve the draft report to myself? Grateful for that. And I would note that the deadline for reporting this SSI is the 10th of October. Can I thank the Minister and those that support him for attending this morning? And I'm more than happy to let you go as we conduct our next item in public, but thank you for your attendance this morning. Agenda item 4 is in relation to a cross-party group application to approve a change of purpose. The cross-party group on deafness applied for a change to its purpose to include a reference to deaf blindness. Members will recall that we considered this request at our meeting back on the 26th of June and agreed to seek further information from the convener of the group, particularly in relation to any potential overlap with the work or the purpose of the cross-party group on visual impairment. A response has been received from the convener and has been included in the papers and will be published. We've also received correspondence from the convener of the CPG on visual impairment, which indicates that that group has no objection to the proposed change of purpose for the CPG on deafness and, quote, affirms that the two groups collaborate on issues of mutual interest. So really the question is whether or not we are going to agree, approval of a change of purpose. Do any committee members have any comments? Ruth, can I come to you first?
Thank you, Convener. I don't have an objection to what's proposed. However, on looking at what's happened, I do wonder if this might be a good example for our committee to examine while in the future we're looking at the operation of cross-party groups and what the rules might be for that.
And indeed, perhaps where the decision on whether or not there is overlap is more than just what's relied on. Sue, I think you wanted to come in with a comment.
I recognise what Ruth Maguire is saying there, but I'm reading the letters from both the conveners, and the letters to me do not give me any. I still think that these two should be one CPG. There's talk of how they all work and do everything collaboratively. To me, this is one CPG, and I'm not sure how the rest of my committee members vote. And I know this is a good example, as you've just pointed out, Ruth Maguire. And it is. I just think we've got duplication happening everywhere with this topic.
Do you want to come back, Ruth?
I think I don't entirely disagree with what Sue Webber's saying. I just wonder if at this stage of the session that perhaps the best thing to do might be to let things flow, but however use this as an example to how we proceed for the next session.
Maybe that. I mean, can I thank both members for their contributions? I think you're right. I think when it comes to our inquiry about this, if on the basis of where we are, we allow this to flow, it can be an example that we can look at in more detail over decisions about where overlap is and who takes responsibility for perhaps pointing out, because it is interesting the correspondence talks about working so much in common, but yet at the last bit. Any other comments from Emma or Annie, or are we content to allow for this change of purpose, but with an indication, obviously the change of purpose is a requirement of the rules, but that we will write to these CPGs and invite them to contribute to our inquiry in the new year? Are we content with that? Yeah, please, Sue. Yeah.
Your remarks, convener, maybe just, is that sort of warning shot across other, so they're aware that, it's partly due to the position in the session that they're being permitted to carry on as individuals.
Yes.
Had this been decision taken. Yes, I'd be a bit firmer in your comms. If you
I think it's very eloquently put on the public record.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good. So are members content to approve the request to change to the purpose of the CPG on deafness? Yes. And we will write to invite. I'm grateful. I'll now move this meeting into private.
Time for a coffee for you.